The street is still, but not silent. Wood creaks as it cools in the early morning air. Somewhere behind paper walls, a kettle begins to boil, its low sound steady, patient. Footsteps pass, measured, unhurried, sandals brushing packed earth. A shopkeeper slides open a shutter that has been closed since dusk, revealing bolts of cloth dyed deep indigo, colors meant to endure. Above it all hangs a discipline of routine, so ingrained that it feels eternal. And yet, beneath this calm order, the world is changing. No banners announce it, no cannon fire marks the hour. Change arrives quietly, in the rhythm of daily life, in the way people bow, in the roads they travel, in the laws they obey without question. Generations are born into a system so complete that it appears natural, even inevitable. Few stop to ask how it came to be, or what it cost to build. What does peace look like after a century of war? And what must a society surrender to keep it? This is Japan in the 17th century. Not a moment of sudden catastrophe, but a long, deliberate transformation. One that reshaped power, belief, and identity, and sealed the fate of an entire civilization for more than 200 years. The period we now call the Edo era began at the dawn of the 1600s, after decades of civil war had torn the country apart. Daimyo armies had burned fields, toppled castles, and reduced provinces to exhaustion. Loyalty had been fluid, violence had been personal and constant. For a time, Japan seemed locked in an endless struggle where survival depended on the sword. Then, almost abruptly, the fighting stopped. In 1603, a single military leader consolidated control over the country and established a new form of rule. From that moment forward, Japan would be governed not by an emperor who commanded armies, but by a shogunate that mastered administration, surveillance, and social order. The capital of this new regime was Edo, a modest fishing village that would soon become one of the largest cities on earth. What followed was not merely a political settlement. It was an experiment in stability on a scale rarely attempted in human history. For more than 2 centuries, Japan would remain at peace. Its borders would tighten, its society would harden into defined roles. Warriors would become bureaucrats. Merchants would grow wealthy in a world that officially denied their importance. Farmers would carry the moral weight of the nation while living close to hunger. Religion, art, and daily ritual would adapt to a new reality, one where order mattered more than ambition. This mattered far beyond Japan's shores. While Europe expanded outward through conquest and colonization, Japan turned inward, refining itself. While global trade networks widened, Japan chose control over connection. The choices made in the 17th century shaped how the country would confront the modern world when isolation finally cracked. To understand Japan today, its reverence for order, its tension between tradition and change, its careful balance between authority and community, we must walk its streets as they were 400 years ago. Before the closed gates. Before the long peace became invisible. Before stability itself became a kind of prison. The moment has a name, though those living through it rarely used it. History would later call it the beginning of the Edo period, a tour not of spectacle, but of structure. A Japan remade in the 17th century under the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate. In 1600, the decisive Battle of Sekigahara ended a century of near-constant civil war. 3 years later, Tokugawa Ieyasu was formally appointed shogun. With that title came more than military authority. It brought the power to reorder society itself. From his seat in Edo, far from the old imperial court in Kyoto, the Tokugawa regime began constructing a system designed to do one thing above all else: prevent chaos from ever returning. This was not merely a change of rulers. It was a redefinition of how power would function. Japan became a country where authority flowed downward through rigid hierarchies, where loyalty was regulated, movement was monitored, and ambition was carefully constrained. The emperor remained, revered and distant, but real governance lay in the hands of the shogun and his administrators. The scale of this transformation was immense. Japan in the 1600s held a population of roughly 30 million people, comparable to the largest European states of the time. Its cities were growing rapidly. Edo itself would soon rival London and Paris in size. Roads connected provinces with unprecedented efficiency. A national economy, though tightly controlled, began to emerge. Globally, this moment coincided with a violent age of expansion elsewhere. European empires crossed oceans, carved colonies, and extracted wealth through force. Firearms and maritime trade reshaped the balance of power across continents. Japan was aware of this world. Portuguese traders had arrived decades earlier. Missionaries had spread Christianity with surprising speed. Foreign ships still appeared on the horizon. And yet, Japan chose a different path. Rather than compete outward, the Tokugawa state focused inward. Rather than encourage mobility, it fixed people in place. Rather than reward innovation, it prized continuity. The 17th century became an era not of conquest, but of containment, of people, ideas, and violence. The stakes of this choice were profound. Peace would allow agriculture to recover, cities to flourish, and culture to bloom. But peace also required surveillance. Stability demanded sacrifice. To keep the sword sheathed, the state would reshape daily life down to the smallest gesture. Who could wear silk? Who could carry weapons? Who could travel? Who could speak freely? This was a world built deliberately, layer by layer, policy by policy. It did not collapse suddenly, nor did it rise overnight. It settled into place like sediment, hardening over time. To understand how this order felt to those who lived inside it, we must look back one step further, to the world just before it solidified, to a Japan still marked by confidence, faith in hierarchy, and the belief that control, once achieved, could last forever. The world before the long peace. Before peace became policy, Japan was a country shaped by motion. Armies marched across provinces. Alliances shifted with marriages, betrayals, and sudden deaths. Castles rose on hillsides not as symbols, but as necessities. Power was personal, visible, and always contested. Yet even amid the violence of the late 16th century, there was confidence. The warrior class believed itself essential. Daimyo ruled their domains with near-sovereign authority. Samurai carried swords not only as weapons, but as proof of status and purpose. Warfare was brutal, but it followed codes that gave meaning to sacrifice. Honor, loyalty, and reputation mattered because survival depended on them. The countryside bore the cost. Farmers rebuilt burned fields again and again, taxed by whichever lord held power that season. Still, agriculture expanded. Irrigation improved. Rice yields increased. Despite chaos at the top, the land continued to feed the population. This created a dangerous illusion that the system, however violent, was sustainable. Religion offered explanation and endurance. Buddhism framed suffering as part of a moral cycle. Shinto bound communities to place and ancestry. Even Christianity, newly arrived with European traders, promised order of a different kind, one that transcended clan and lord. Belief systems multiplied, not yet fully controlled. Cities were growing, but they were not yet dominant. Kyoto remained the cultural heart, refined and ceremonial. Osaka thrived as a commercial hub, its warehouses linking regional economies. Edo existed, but it was peripheral, a marshy settlement with no special destiny yet attached to it. What held this world together was not peace, but expectation. Everyone understood that power would eventually consolidate again, as it always had. A stronger lord would rise, rivals would fall, stability would return through force. When it finally did, in the early 1600s, it arrived not as a continuation of the old pattern, but as its negation. The Tokugawa victory did not simply end the wars. It made them unnecessary, and eventually unthinkable. The warrior class, once defined by battle, would be redefined by obedience. Movement, once essential to ambition, would be restricted. Identity itself would be regulated. What had once been a society organized around conflict would become one organized around prevention. The seeds of that transformation were already present. Decades of warfare had exhausted the land and the people. Too many swords, too many ambitions, too much memory of chaos. Peace was not merely desired, it was demanded. But peace, once achieved, does not maintain itself. To preserve it, the Tokugawa state would need to understand the deeper forces that had produced disorder in the first place. Not just rival armies, but economic pressures, shifting loyalties, new technologies, and ideas that moved faster than laws. The origins of the Edo world lay not in one battle, but in the slow recognition that human systems, left unchecked, always generate instability. The long peace of the 17th century was not born from optimism. It emerged from diagnosis. Tokugawa rule was shaped by a hard-earned understanding of why Japan had fractured in the first place. The wars of the previous century were not caused by a single villain or ambition run wild. They were the result of systems that rewarded violence, mobility, and personal loyalty over institutional control. Land had been the core problem. Rice was wealth, and wealth meant soldiers. Daimyo competed to expand their domains because expansion was survival. There were few fixed boundaries and fewer mechanisms to enforce them. Victory today meant vulnerability tomorrow. Every gain invited retaliation. The logic of the system pushed relentlessly toward conflict. Technology intensified this pressure. Firearms, introduced in the mid-16th century, spread rapidly. They lowered the cost of raising armies and increased the speed at which power could shift. A peasant trained to use a musket could alter the outcome of a battle once reserved for elite warriors. This democratization of violence destabilized old hierarchies without replacing them with new ones. Trade, too, played a role. As domestic commerce expanded and foreign merchants arrived, money began to rival land as a source of influence. Wealth moved faster than titles. Lords who controlled ports or trade routes gained advantages that the older order had not anticipated. Economic change outpaced political adaptation. Even belief systems contributed to instability. Loyalty to a lord competed with loyalty to faith, family, or personal ambition. Christianity, in particular, crossed social boundaries and introduced allegiances that could not be easily monitored or contained. For a ruling class obsessed with control, this was not merely a religious concern, it was a political one. The Tokugawa solution addressed all of these pressures simultaneously. Land would be frozen into fixed domains. Daimyo would rule, but not expand. Wealth would be monitored and redistributed through obligation rather than conquest. Movement would be regulated, preventing alliances from forming beyond state supervision. Violence would be monopolized by the government, not eliminated, but confined. This was governance as engineering. The Tokugawa state did not trust virtue or goodwill to maintain peace. It trusted structure. Every class would have a defined role. Samurai would receive stipends instead of spoils. Farmers would be tied to the land that fed the system. Artisans would supply the tools of daily life. Merchants, though economically vital, would be placed at the bottom of the moral hierarchy, denied political power even as their influence grew. The result was a society designed to slow change. Not stop it entirely, change is inevitable, but slow it enough that it could be observed, regulated, and absorbed without collapse. Innovation would occur in controlled forms, in art, in urban life, in subtle adaptations of custom. What would be prevented was the kind of sudden disruption that had once turned provinces into battlefields. This was the philosophical core of the Edo world. Order was not a natural state. It was an achievement that required constant maintenance. And maintenance, in turn, required limits. Those limits would soon be felt not as abstract policy, but as lived experience, on roads, in households, in the silence of weapons that were no longer meant to be used. The transformation now moved from theory into daily life. The change did not arrive with shock or spectacle. It unfolded in ordinances, inspections, and habits repeated until they became invisible. Roads were the first to feel it. Once used by marching armies, they became arteries of supervision. Checkpoints appeared at bridges and mountain passes. Travelers were questioned, documents examined, intentions weighed. Movement was no longer an expression of ambition, but a privilege granted by authority. To walk from one province to another was to enter the state's gaze. In the towns, sound changed. The clatter of armor faded. Swords remained at the waist of samurai, but they were rarely drawn. Their presence was symbolic now, an echo of violence contained by law. Disputes that once ended in blood were redirected into petitions, rituals of apology, and the slow machinery of judgment. Castles, too, were transformed. Many were dismantled, their stones reused, their silhouettes erased from the landscape. Those that remained became administrative centers rather than fortresses. Their gates opened onto offices, storehouses, and living quarters. The architecture of power turned inward, focused on record-keeping rather than defense. The most profound change, however, unfolded within households. Samurai families adjusted to a life without war. Stipends replaced plunder. Education replaced combat as the measure of worth. Children learned calligraphy and moral philosophy alongside martial drills they might never use. Anxiety lingered beneath the surface. What did it mean to be a warrior in a world that no longer needed warriors? Farmers experienced the peace differently. Fields were safer, harvests more predictable, but obligations were fixed and unforgiving. Taxes were assessed in rice, binding survival to yield. A bad season could mean ruin. Yet revolt was rare. The memory of war was still too close. Stability, even harsh stability, felt preferable to chaos. In the cities, a quieter drama played out. Merchants thrived in the gaps between regulation and necessity. Official ideology dismissed them as morally inferior, yet the urban economy increasingly depended on their credit, logistics, and networks. Shops multiplied, markets expanded. Pleasure districts emerged, carefully contained, yet vibrantly alive. Art, theater, and fashion flourished in spaces where politics could not intrude openly. Edo itself became the stage on which all these tensions converged. Swollen by retainers compelled to reside there part of the year, the city grew at an astonishing pace. Fires swept through wooden neighborhoods, only to be rebuilt again and again. Bureaucrats tracked population, supplies, and conduct. Life in Edo was dense, disciplined, and restless beneath its order. What made this transformation remarkable was not that people obeyed, but that they adapted. The system did not rely solely on fear. It reshaped incentives, identities, and expectations. Over time, the extraordinary became ordinary. Restrictions felt normal. Surveillance blended into routine. The peace held, not because people were free, but because they learned how to live within its boundaries. Yet no system remained static. Beneath the surface of order, pressures accumulated. The very mechanisms that prevented collapse began to strain under their own weight. The drama of the Edo world was not in sudden violence, but in slow imbalance. Stability, once achieved, began to generate its own failures. The Tokugawa system depended on balance between classes, between domains, between revenue and obligation. When that balance shifted, the effects did not explode outward. They rippled inward, quietly, persistently. At the center stood the samurai. Their stipends were fixed, their costs rising. Prices in the cities climbed as commerce expanded, but samurai income did not. Many borrowed from the very merchants they were taught to disdain. Debt eroded dignity. Authority remained, but confidence thinned. A ruling class trained for war and administration found itself trapped between expectation and reality. Local governments felt the pressure next. Daimyo were bound by strict regulations, including mandatory residence in Edo for part of each year. The system worked as intended, preventing rebellion by draining resources, but it also strained finances. Processions were costly. Residences in Edo had to be maintained. Lavish displays became compulsory performances of loyalty. Over time, debt spread from households to entire domains. Agriculture, the moral foundation of the state, proved fragile. Population growth pressed against limited arable land. Crop failures, when they came, exposed the rigidity of tax demands. Grain reserves softened disaster, but not always enough. Hunger returned in cycles, not catastrophic, but corrosive. The promise of peace lost some of its luster. Religion, once a stabilizing force, was reconfigured into surveillance. Temples became registration centers. Faith became proof of conformity. This brought order, but also hollowed belief into administration. Spiritual explanation yielded to compliance. Meaning thinned where ritual remained. Even the roads, symbols of control, became conduits of tension. Information moved faster than officials intended. Rumors traveled with travelers. Stories of misrule or suffering, though muted, circulated. The system could monitor movement, but not silence thought. What collapsed was not the state, but the illusion that control could be permanent without adjustment. Each safeguard created new dependencies. Each restriction generated quiet resistance, not rebellion, but disengagement, adaptation, evasion. The Edo world did not fall apart. It wore down. And as the material structures strained, so too did the inner worlds of the people living within them. When a society is denied open rupture, it turns inward. The people of 17th century Japan did not experience collapse as a single traumatic moment. They experienced it as uncertainty without language. Life remained orderly, the seasons turned, officials remained in place, and yet something felt misaligned. For the samurai, this dissonance was existential. Their identity rested on readiness for death in service of a lord. But death no longer came. Loyalty was expressed through paperwork, etiquette, and restraint. Some embraced Confucian ideals of moral cultivation, redefining honor as discipline rather than valor. Others retreated into nostalgia, idealizing a past of clear purpose that could not return. Among farmers and townspeople, explanation took quieter forms. Misfortune was framed as moral imbalance, cosmic warning, or inevitable hardship. There was little space to question the system openly. Instead, people adjusted expectations downward. Endurance replaced aspiration. Intellectual life responded with subtlety. Scholars turned to history, poetry, and philosophy, not as rebellion, but as refuge. Neo-Confucian thought emphasized hierarchy and harmony, offering justification for order even as lived experience complicated it. Buddhism absorbed anxiety, teaching impermanence without promising escape. Art carried what speech could not. Woodblock prints captured fleeting pleasures. Theater explored loyalty, betrayal, and sacrifice in coded form. Humor thrived in the margins, not as mockery of power, but as relief from its weight. Meaning migrated into culture. Perhaps the most profound shift was psychological. People learned to live with contradiction, a peaceful world that constrained them, a stable order that demanded surrender. This was not despair, it was adaptation. A collective recalibration of what life could reasonably promise. In doing so, the Edo world forged a distinctive mindset, one that valued endurance, subtlety, and indirect expression. Conflict was not eliminated, it was internalized. This inward turn preserved the system longer than force alone could have. But it also meant that when change finally came, it would arrive not as reform from within, but as rupture from without. First, however, there would be attempts to rebuild meaning, to refine the system rather than abandon it. Rebuilding in the Edo world did not mean replacing the system. It meant learning how to live inside it more completely. Authority remained firmly in Tokugawa hands, but governance evolved. Administrators refined laws, adjusted tax practices, and invested in infrastructure. Flood control projects reshaped rivers, roads were improved. Urban planning became more deliberate, balancing density with fire breaks and canals. The state learned from its own stresses, even as it resisted fundamental change. Education expanded beyond the warrior class. Domain schools taught literacy and ethics to samurai children. Private academies appeared in towns, offering learning to merchants and artisans. Knowledge spread not as a challenge to authority, but as a tool for functioning within it. A literate society emerged, one capable of record-keeping, trade, and cultural production at remarkable scale. Culturally, the transformation was profound. What the Edo period lost in political dynamism, it gained in artistic depth. Poetry, theater, and visual art matured into forms that prized nuance over grandeur. Beauty was found in restraint, impermanence, and the ordinary. This aesthetic was not accidental. It reflected a world where ambition was curtailed and meaning had to be discovered in small, transient moments. Economic life adapted with quiet sophistication. Merchants developed credit systems, contracts, and networks that anticipated modern finance. Though officially marginalized, they became indispensable. Power shifted subtly, from swords to ledgers, from lineage to liquidity, without ever being formally acknowledged. The most significant transformation, however, was temporal. Time itself slowed. With no wars to punctuate generations, memory stretched. People lived and died within the same structures their grandparents had known. Stability became invisible, assumed rather than celebrated. This long continuity shaped how Japan would encounter the future. When external pressure finally forced change, the shock would be immense. Not because the society was weak, but because it had been so carefully held still. The 17th century did not end in the 17th century. Its decisions echoed forward, shaping Japan long after the streets of Edo fell silent. The most enduring legacy was institutional memory. For more than 200 years, Japan experienced internal peace. This was not an accident of geography or fortune. It was the result of deliberate design. The idea that stability could be engineered through hierarchy, surveillance, and ritual became deeply embedded in political culture. Modern Japan inherited this instinct. Even as forms of governance changed, the preference for order, continuity, and social cohesion remained. Sudden disruption came to be viewed not as opportunity, but as failure of foresight. Economically, the Edo world laid foundations that would later accelerate modernization. High literacy, dense urban networks, and sophisticated markets meant that when Japan finally reopened to the world in the 19th century, it could adapt with extraordinary speed. What appeared as isolation had, paradoxically, prepared the ground for rapid integration. Culturally, the period defined sensibilities that endure today. The value placed on discipline, the aesthetic of restraint, the respect for process over outcome. These were not abstract ideals. They were survival strategies developed in a society where harmony had to be maintained among millions. There was also a cost. The suppression of political mobility delayed reforms that might have eased later shocks. When external powers forced Japan to abandon isolation, the transition was abrupt and destabilizing. The very rigidity that preserved peace made adjustment painful. Yet it is impossible to separate modern Japan from the choices of the 1600s. The balance between authority and community, between innovation and control, remains a central tension. The Edo period did not resolve this tension. It taught a civilization how to live with it. This is why a tour of 17th century Japan is not a journey into distant history. It is a walk through the architecture of the present. One final question remains, not about policy or power, but about meaning. Imagine walking those streets again, centuries later. The wooden buildings are gone, the canals have been reshaped or buried, the swords have been locked behind glass. And yet, the rhythm remains. Order without spectacle. Change approached carefully. A deep respect for systems that hold people together, even when they constrain them. The Japan of the 1600s did not seek to dominate the world. It sought to survive itself. After generations of violence, it chose restraint over expansion, continuity over risk. In doing so, it created one of the longest periods of peace in recorded history, not by erasing human ambition, but by channeling it. That choice shaped how people thought, worked, believed, and endured. It taught a society to value balance, to distrust sudden transformation, and to find meaning in repetition and refinement. These were not abstract philosophies, they were answers to lived experience. History often celebrates moments of collapse and conquest, but sometimes the most consequential changes happen quietly, when a civilization decides not to move forward, but to hold still. The streets of Edo remind us that stability is never free. It is purchased with limits, maintained by discipline, and inherited by those who did not choose it. And the question it leaves behind is not whether the choice was right or wrong, but whether any society, once shaped by its own solutions, can ever fully escape them. Watching the past to understand the present.